You are listening to Single Serves. My name is Arno Marture and I am your host. Single Serves is a podcast dealing with design, architecture, business, and city building in which I interview an expert on a specific subject matter. Together, we dive into that topic and challenge conventional thinking in a thought-provoking conversation. For our inaugural season, we have some great guests lined up, and you can expect to hear about such topics like social media for architects, organizational culture, criticism in media, and architects not practicing architecture, among many others. I sincerely hope that you will find these conversations as engaging as I did and learn a thing or two in the process. Don't forget to send us your comments, criticism, and praise. To do so, you can email us at hello@rvltr.studio or leave a comment online. You can also subscribe to the podcast on our website at rvltr.studio and follow us on social media under the handle at Révélateur_TO. It's REVELATEUR_TO. Hey, Arno here. I recorded this interview back in the spring of 2020. So the kids today would call this prehistoric. But its overall theme is as relevant as ever, hence my desire to publish it. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get back to regular programming. So today on the podcast, our guest is Alan Jones. Alan Jones is a registered architect, principal of Alan Jones Architects, a professor of architecture at Queen's University Belfast, and the current president of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Thanks, Alan, for being on the show. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thanks for inviting me.
So you and I are going to talk about the past and the future of architecture today. And the context in which we've met initially was that you attended the RIIC festival in Toronto a few months ago. And you made, during a variety of interventions you had throughout the festival, some really good points about the challenges that architecture is going through currently. And I think some of those challenges apply to a lot of different architecture markets, whether it's the UK, Canada, the US, or elsewhere. So can you start with telling us what do you think is the problem with architecture?
Well, interestingly, the first thing I have a problem with is the term architecture, in that I'm a firm believer in the role that architects have. So I much prefer to use the term architects. One might argue then what's the problem with architects might be the question then that I would like to answer. I think part of the reason why I prefer to focus on architects rather than architecture is I think traditionally people think what architects do is create architecture, but in fact the outcome of involving an architect may not be a building, it may not be a piece of architecture. The answer might be to do something different. So to me, the assumption that it is a building, or especially now in the times of climate emergency, that it is a new building is not a foregone conclusion. So that's I think a starting point. So to me, the question of what's the problem with architects would be a perception of what we do. That very often I think we've been thought of as doing drawings and providing a service to create new buildings. But in fact, what I'm arguing for is that we should be very much more at the front end of what I refer to as ideas and strategy. Interestingly, I think it was Fred Olson, when he was talking about a very early career Norman Foster, he said about Norman Foster, he said that he asks the right questions, and it's that really early stages. Pierre Vassenaar is an architect here in the UK with an MBA, and he talks about lingering longer at the beginning of a project before we decide to go off in a particular direction. So it's that early stages, and how do we, for example, address that strategic role of architects when we still do competitions, and one might argue give our what is most valuable away for free as we pursue new commissions. There's lots of people ask me, for example, when I'm president, what are you going to do? And because most presidents only focus on one or two things, and I think my my problem as a president of the Royal Institute of British Architects is there are so many fronts, so it's a broad front, that one would argue in terms of education, how we equip our future architects with the skills to really step up to issues around climate emergency and public safety. How do we upskill a current profession that has been, here in the UK, it has been put into a corner, if you like, and sort of put under the stairs in a lot of contracts. And you hear stories of architects not being allowed to come to site. And if you like, undertake the traditional role that we've always thought that architects did, which was to be the champions for quality and on delivery of ideas and strategies. So it's a huge area for me in terms of problems, potential solutions, opportunities. I could talk for a long time.
Yeah, I'm sure. But so what I'm hearing, and you can tell me if I understand that correctly, is that architecture and architects would benefit from taking a more strategic and holistic approach to design, much like you would see in the fields of design thinking, especially applied to businesses. And there's been some pretty incredible examples out there in the last 20 years. Is that a fair comparison?
It's an interesting comparison. When I go to visit practices, I often ask, how many different ways do you design? And sometimes I get sort of puzzled faces or puzzled sort of expressions. And I explain, which is sort of in line with your comment, that design to me is, I don't play golf, but you think of it almost like a sort of set of golf clubs that you need to work out what way do you design at a particular stage to get the most and to reveal the potential ways forward. And I remember putting up one image of that showed 33 different ways of designing, and somebody said, "Oh no, actually, Alan, there are 100 different ways of designing." And it's that design as process. There's a fantastic past president of the RIBA, Frank Duffy, who wrote a whole series of essays on knowledge and acquiring knowledge and expertise and how that sort of manifests itself as an architect. And we could have learned a lot from, taking his advice way back when he was president in the sort of late 80s. And so, yes, it's becoming interested again in the process of design. The practices that I worked with in my formative years as a sort of early career practitioner, I worked with Michael Hopkins and Partners. Michael Hopkins was one of the early partners with Norman Foster, and then with David Morley, who was again one of the a partner at Foster's. And it was very much about talking about the process of how to design, and actually explaining the design process to clients. Really got everybody's head nodding, as I would say, on the other side of the table. Everybody sort of understood the sort of the logic or the evidence and so on. But I'm beginning to understand that, or appreciate that sometimes design just isn't about logic. It's sometimes it's actually turning logic on its head that finds the right answers. So it's very much at the front end, of the process, but following it all the way right through from early stages. And this is the challenge for architects. And I think a lot of it is not to do with architects themselves, but the circumstances we find ourselves in through government procurement systems and so on, where those ideas are separated from the original author. And I mean that as a practice, not just as an individual, and how that is then transferred through the procurement process through to development and actually delivery. And how Phil Bernstein from Yale talks about how 80% to be exact. He said 80% of projects don't deliver on the promise. And I think a lot of that is actually to do with the systems that we find ourselves in, or frameworks of being able to follow those ideas through to reality. So it's that sort of what's I think referred to as building performance management, how we keep those ideas, and obviously they have to evolve, but how do you develop and allow ideas to mature and obviously slightly alter as a project goes forward, I think is the real challenge. And it's architects working with obviously engineers and specialist consultants and contractors, but it seems to be very often disrupted through procurement systems that are focusing on a small set of parameters in terms of success, namely time and money, and not the longer term and the overall performance.
Yeah, and we've spoken extensively about procurement on this podcast and other avenues as well. So I'm not going to get into it, but it's clear that there's a whole host of issues related to that in Canada, and I'm sure you have similar issues in the UK as well. So you've spoken before about the need for architecture to reposition itself, and what do you mean by that?
Well, it's interesting. An illustration of this would be the RIBA is going through a rebranding process at the minute. Mm-hmm. And as I say to people, don't think font and color of typeface or anything like that. It's actually repositioning. I think the problem we have as architects and what we do, and one would argue and about architecture itself, it's seen as for the privileged few. And how do we actually reposition architecture and architects in particular, that what we do is seen as essential? In most countries, you'll find that what we do as architects sits across a whole series of different government departments to do with business, innovation, design, culture, well-being and health, and so on. And on one hand, that's actually an advantage, but on the other hand, it's actually a disadvantage in that it's hard to have a focus. So what I've been suggesting here at the RIBA is, so when we reposition, if we imagine we were to create a poster, I'm not saying that we do a poster campaign, but if it was a poster and you have a piece of late 60s, early 70s brutalist architecture, like say one of Erno Goldfinger's tower block buildings, Trillic Tower, for example, or Balfron Tower, two famous projects here in London, that you look at them and yes, somebody might say, oh, there's brutalist architecture. You go, yes, but it is also a manifestation of technology, attitudes towards environment and energy, also social policy, planning, and so on, that you actually start to realize that actually architecture folds in a whole series of issues together. And it's bringing that home. I agree. There a comment a number of years ago, it's not about educating the client or educating the public. I think those are terrible terms. But to think of it as actually, we've got a lot to do to explain our worth. And then that's the point I'm making, that it's not, and that's how I've been brought up in practice as well at Hopkins. It's not about the receiver receiving the message wrong. It's actually what is the message is the thing that we have to be very, very, very clear on. So I was pleased. I'm sure you heard me talk in Toronto about the Sterling Prize, about the Goldsmith Street winning the Sterling Prize, and there you have, instead of that's for your listeners to explain. That's the top architecture award in the UK, and that's, if you imagine local, regional awards, then going forward to national awards. Out of those national awards, we pick 6 or 7 shortlisted schemes for the Sterling Prize, and then the Sterling Prize is from that final shortlist.
And to be clear, the Sterling Prize is for a building, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has to be for an award winning of that particular year. And this year, in 2019. That went to a 100% social housing, passive house, low energy project that was traditional contract, delivered by architects that were involved from the start to the finish, under a traditional procurement contract as well, for a local authority. And to me, in terms of repositioning, that is a fantastic message in terms of actually saying, here we have high quality design delivered at a low budget, and where the energy bills, for example, are, in your money, would be what, $200 a year? Which I know we have a more moderate or more temperate climate than than listeners in Canada, for example, would have. But
so you're saying the energy bill would be $200 a year?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what the typical energy bill is here a month. So
what it is, and also because of the passive house, which is a German technical standard, also filters the air, that you've got much reduced asthma, you've got higher attendances at school, you've got less absenteeism from work, and so on. So there's spin-offs in terms of our National Health Service costs and so on as well. So that's, in terms of repositioning, I think that's a perfect example of what architects do and the impact that they can have in terms of safe places for children to play, how the winter sun isn't blocked out by the housing block in front of you, that the roof has been designed to allow the sun to come into your living room and your kitchen in the wintertime. All of those sorts of the benefits of architecture and what architects do, I think, is key to that repositioning. I think us just to stand and say, oh, we deserve to be understood and we deserve to be appreciated, I think we have to, if you like, be on the front foot and actually sort of explain a lot more what what benefits we bring. So, for example, there just last week at the Houses of Parliament here in the UK, there were the RIBA and the climate challenge that we've put forward to all our chartered practices was being mentioned as leadership by the architects in the industry to address climate emergency. And again, that's part of the repositioning, is actually taking the lead instead of being pushed around. It's actually sort of, being a bit more proactive. I'm not saying that we haven't in the past, but it's actually just being very, very determined and seizing opportunities. And it's terrible to think of climate emergency as an opportunity, but when you see a door opening, take it and actually make sure that we take our lead and upskill. We sort of are writing a brief at the minute for our schools of architecture to actually again really change how we do things. I'm referring to it as the new emphasis, that we have to really demonstrate our worth and be prepared to actually deliver on it as well.
Mm-hmm. So that's very interesting. Position on positioning, to be a little bit oxymoronic, but I want to touch on one point that you made early on when you answered that question. You said that architecture has been by and large a service for the elites, and I had the pleasure to talk to one of your colleagues, Andrew Wall from Wall Thistleton, a couple of months ago, because he was in Toronto for a talk, and I did an interview with him, and he compared the current traditional practice of architecture to someone building a very high-end custom car in their garage where every part is made by hand and fitted perfectly. So very high level of craft, but there's an opportunity for architecture. He seems to think, and I tend to agree with him, to take on more the model of mass manufacturing of automobiles and having the ability to make very customized products, but still sold at a very reasonable price. And there was one statistic that he mentioned to me that I thought was very interesting, is that apparently on average, Nissan makes the same car once every 7 years. So by that, I mean, for a given model to have the exact same car with all the exact same specs and color and leather on the seats and whatever, it comes out about once every 7 years, which means that if 7 years is the average lifespan of a model, you might have 2 or 3 exact same vehicles in the lifetime of a given model and still give the ability to customize for people to customize their vehicles. So I understand it's not a 100% applicable metaphor, but I think it's a very interesting way to think about how architecture could be practiced. And Wall Thistleton is actually a very interesting practice because they try to do as much prefabrication, especially with CLT type of structures, as they can. And so moving more in the direction of mass customization, for lack of a better term. What's your take on that?
There's 2 ways, I think, about this. One is to look at the practice, the Dutch practice, Klaus and Kahn. They were writing over 15 years ago about using standard products. So one thing is actually just using, instead of trying to make everything bespoke, that you use standard materials. And the way I think of that is that architecture resides in a DIY store. So one is to sort of customize and make something really specific, but make it, consumer choosable, if you know what I mean. But the other is to think of actually what are the materials that are being used. And if it's something that's really simple, low, and very, very low tech, that's one way of making it very accessible, using very everyday everyday products. And then obviously Rural Studio, for example, is an example of where you can use almost like things that you find in, I wouldn't say dumps, but recycle centers and so on, and DIY stores. So you go low tech, so that making it accessible isn't using the finest stone from Italy or the special glass from Japan or whatever. It's finding different ways of using very, very simple products. And then the other way is obviously the car industry analogy. And there is a big push here in the UK on off-site digital fabrication and so on. So it's I can see both working. So the low tech cheap materials, and it's how those materials are combined together. So that's one method, and the other method is to give choice. And yeah, both can work. That's my response.
So going back to the idea of positioning for architects, and you've spoken a little bit about that, but is there anything you can point out in the way of what would need to change in the industry for that the profession really to connect or be in tune with what's happening in the 21st century?
Right. What I would think on that is that I think we have to consider how we define success. I think that would be part of the repositioning, how we as architects define success, and how our clients and how society would define success. I think needs to be, I wouldn't say reconsidered, but let's just say considered further. There's my wife's a dentist, and if you imagine becoming, there was a movement here to make dentists more client focused, and if you imagine, that there's that phrase, architecture for architects, and it was in Rory Hyde's book on future practice. It referred to architects retreating to the drawing board, and almost becoming internalized, and patting each other on the back. And I know peer review is part of a profession, but it's reorientating how we define success, I think, is one of the key points to make.
So in your view, how would you define that? What would be the kind of main criteria for defining success in architecture from your perspective?
The recipient of the Royal Gold Medal for 2020, if we look at them, and that's Grafton Architects, and that was actually a practice that was awarded the medal, not an individual or a pair of individuals. And I think that's where, if you like, redefining success starts, is that we realize that it's a team effort. One of my pieces for the Royal Institute RIBA Journal was looking at this, and I refer to it as a team of individuals. And I think that's where we realize is that that I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to be the master of everything, or in terms of knowing about everything. And we realize, and that's the point that Grafton Architects were making, is that we will receive this medal, but as a practice, because actually it takes a whole series of different people, those who are winning the competitions and good at the front end, those who are good at the development, those who are good at the actual delivery, and so on, and together that they create architecture. So I wondered if the fact that the gold medal went to a practice, I think it's only gone to a practice since 1834. I think it's only gone to a practice maybe 2 or 3 times at best. And I think that's part of it. Instead of education, for example, really pushing, the sort of star architect idea, and that starts to make people think, well, that if, as architects, if we're not that person and having that sort of level of performance, that somehow we've failed. No, that we play to our, that we are the product of our upbringing, in terms of our experiences, in terms of, what we did in the summers, what schools we went to, and the environment that we were brought up in, and so we're these individuals, but we come together to actually create architecture, and provide a service. And I think that's where I would say it starts, is that redefining of that we have to work together on this.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. So what are some opportunities you see for the architecture profession to tackle first? Maybe 2 or 3 priority items, and still from the idea of repositioning the profession. What would you see needs to change first? What would you say needs to change first?
Well, interestingly, that I think generally people think that the professions are dying, and there was Tom Nichols' book, which The Death of Expertise, was quite gloomy, but it's only in the final chapter that he actually suggests that the way to redeem a profession, unfortunately, is through disasters. And to me, the disasters that are really sort of requiring the profession to change are the twin disasters of climate emergency And the other one for us here in the UK is Grenfell, the fire where over 70 people were killed and obviously a lot more were injured. That was a high-rise block, and that had only been refurbished 2 years previously. So, the public inquiry is on at the minute, and the architects are on the stand, and, there's all that's been live streamed and so on. But what it really brings home is those are the two immediate disasters that we have to respond to, but there's also others on the horizon. So it's sort of on climate emergency, I think is the first thing, is making a commitment in terms of how we will operate. We've done that here in the UK through something called the Climate Challenge 2030. There's also how we change what we expect people to know in terms of our members, in terms of CPD and continuing professional development. That's important, but obviously we have to then put pressure on government to actually allow us to deliver on that. So there's that. So we have to also lead by example. So we've introduced, for example, a new CPD recording platform, and it will be a gradual change over a number of years. I don't know in Canada, for example, if you get thrown off the Architects Register for not doing your CPD. But again, I mentioned my wife, the dentist. You're not a dentist in the UK if you don't do your CPD. And so there's a journey for our profession, I believe, in becoming much more rigorous in terms of what we know, how we prove what we know, how we develop, how we respond to the issues of the day, and how we upskill for those issues. So there's that. I think would be one of the really, and again for fire, how we ensure that our architects are up to steam with the current regulations and the thinking about how those regulations might evolve in the near future.
Yeah, and when you say CPD, you're talking about continuing education, right?
That's right.
Yeah, yes. So it's called Con Ed here. I believe that you've been traveling quite extensively to other jurisdictions, and I'm going to take a wild guess and say that part of it is to kind of see how things are done elsewhere. What have you seen in those other markets that works well and you think is very promising?
Well, interestingly, with the virus pandemic or risk of pandemic, my travel has stopped. I was meant to be in the Far East for the last 2 weeks. That stopped. I'm meant to be at MIBIM next week for the south of France for the big property conference. That's been cancelled. So my travels have been really just within the UK and not elsewhere as much as I would like. So Canada was great, but I haven't been recently. I haven't been elsewhere. It's really just been within the UK and Scotland and Ireland.
And so, can you speak to some other some things you've seen or heard about from other places that you think are good examples of what the future of the profession could be?
Here's a blatant plug for a book. What I would actually recommend, and I'm sure you can, if you're in a university, it probably is there's a digital copy of Defining Contemporary Professionalism, which was a book that I co-authored or co-edited there, and it came out at the beginning of September. Mm-hmm. And really, that is looking at because your question highlights or makes me think there's multiple facets to what's good ways of doing things, good examples. And what Rob Hyde and myself did was we pulled together 63 different contributions and got them to write 1,000 words each with a few up to 6 further bits of reading. And what that was to do was to sort of help everyone sort of see what potential directions there are on education, on becoming a professional, running a business, how that impacts and starts to connect with regulation, but then also in terms of construction and issues around AI. So I immediately, think of, people who are on the inside cover, on the end papers. There's a diagram with 4 circles of those topics I talked about, and it's like a map. And I immediately think of, say, for example, rural design in the west coast of Scotland, which is probably, would be equivalent to a rural practice in Canada, and how they have 3 income streams, how they just decided we're fed up with big practice in big cities, and we're going to go and make it work and deliver. And they deliver kits, and different sort of forms of customization and standardization. But also they have other revenue streams as well. And that's an example of being very, very local and very, very aware of how to sort of fit into the economy and the climate, I would argue as well, of a particular region. So there's lots of different examples. I think that another example of that diagram would be Bryden Wood, who are a practice slap bang right in the middle of London, started by two partners, two architects from Grimshaw's,
Mm-hmm.
who are the two, Mr. Bryden and Mr. Wood, and that is there are a lot of people looking at that practice in terms of their combination of architecture, but all the other sort of facets of thinking about property, investment, fabrication, construction, off-site, digital, analog, people versus business, et cetera, et cetera. They're one of the sort of slightly below the radar, but there are a lot of people looking at them at the minute as potential ways forward.
So I think that's pretty much it for the questions I had. Is there anything you'd like to add in terms of what your thinking is regarding the future of architecture, the profession, the way it's practiced, and maybe potential new avenues that are not have been overlooked?
To me, looking at what architects do, I think we have to remember, for example, in the UK, that 2/3 of architects are in mainstream practice. But that means that 1/3 are elsewhere, be that in operating as a journalist and a critic, be that working within a contractor as design managers or developers as either the lead and owning a development company. It could be teaching, researching. It could be working within a planning department of a city corporation. It could be working for a third sector charity, on disaster relief.
Mm-hmm.
I think what it is actually, I think all architects are really trying to find the best place to have the most positive impact. And to me, architects exist not just in private practice or in mainstream practice, but everywhere, and it's remembering all of them and how to support them, how to inspire them. Because it became clear there recently here in the RIBA, when there was somebody was preparing a speech and suggesting somebody who was actually operating more on the sort of critic side was a lapsed architect. I go, no, everyone's an architect. And it might be teaching and really inspiring the future architects is the place to have the most impact, whether it's actually writing and critiquing the work of architects and the industry and suggesting how that could evolve could be the best way to have impact. So to me, it's celebrating all the different ways of being an architect and having the most positive impact, I think, is really important, and to celebrate, but also to communicate to architects that we evolve and we change through our career. Where you start and where you end up might be two different things. And I think it's important. I wouldn't like to finish without saying that podcasts, for example, and YouTube and so on, are an important new aspect of knowing and learning about what it is to be an architect and how to have that impact. So I'm pleased to have had the invite. I think it's important. I think podcasts are a fantastic way of whether you're commuting, whether you're in the garden, whether you're doing something else, or even when you're working, to sort of to be continually learning, to continually thinking of how to be better tomorrow. And that's where what you do and others do is really, really important.
Well, I'm glad that resonates with you. And I often think of what I do as like, I'm a lab architect of sorts, and I'm technically not even allowed to call myself an architect because I'm not registered or licensed, as they say here. But I think, like you rightly pointed out, all those professions on the sideline that are related to architecture, but not a practice of architecture in the traditional sense of the term, are equally as important. And I believe, as much as you do, that positioning, whether we're talking about an industry or a business, is critically important to get your customers, whoever that might be, to understand what you do and relate to it, to create buy-in on their part, is critically important. And what I do as part of that is to help people understand better what architects do, help architects understand better what their clients aspire to, and all those things. And I think those are just as important as the design. But my peeve with the whole profession, and I've seen this in pretty much every country I've had the chance to practice or study in, is that architecture is a very insular profession. The education of architects is very limited in scope. It trains incredible designers and thinkers, but it fails to from what I've seen, train people on many other aspects of the profession, and especially in the business side of things. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And there's one of my favorite things to do is to look at what other industries are doing and where they're succeeding as a model that could possibly be applied to the architecture profession, because there's a lot to learn. One of my favorite industries to look at is advertising. As much as there's a lot of bad coming out of it, there's also some very important lessons to learn from good advertising, especially as it regards how we sell our thinking as creative people.
I agree. I'm looking at what I have on my desk at the minute here. I'm sitting in my office in London, and I have Rory Sutherland's book, Alchemy: The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense. And that's he's the vice chair of an advertising company. So I'm with you on that. It's very, very important to look at other, I have actually not that many books on architecture on my desk. Most of them are about AI or about ideas and so on. So I'm with you.
Well, I'm glad to hear. So it was a great pleasure to have you on the interview. And again, I want to thank you a lot for taking the time to take part in this. Let's spread the word and make sure that all those ideas are heard far and wide.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Hey, Arno here. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and that you'll come back for more. Please share with your friends and colleagues, and remember to subscribe on our website at rbltr.studio. Follow us on social media at Révélateur_TO. It's REVELATEUR_TO. Until next time, ciao.